start with George Washington, the first president of the United States. You can see pictured on your screen there. Yeah, so America became an independent nation in 1776. In a sense of that's when independence was declared. As I've talked about already, we had to win. America had to win its independence via war with England. That ended in 1783. There's a new constitution that replaces the original founding document, the Articles of Confederation. And that's eventually written and ratified by the states, and that's the new law of the land. And according to the new constitution, there's three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. One of those branches, the executive branch, is headed by a chief executive, the president of the United States. And not surprisingly, the first president of the United States is George Washington. So George Washington, one of the first things he does upon taking the reins of the presidency is he appoints a cabinet, right? And if you don't know, a cabinet is basically high-ranking officials in a particular polity, a state, and who are appointed in this case by the top person, and in this case the president, right? So it's sort of the president's top appointees, top team, closest advisors, and in a sense, it's a good way to think about it. So two members of his cabinet are the Secretary of State, who's Thomas Jefferson. He chooses Thomas Jefferson, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. And those are two very interesting choices because they're polar opposites. They have two really totally contradictory, totally different visions for what the future of the United States should look like, and how to achieve American prosperity through the rest of the 18th century into the beginning of the 19th century and beyond. So let's get into kind of the two competing visions and see who kind of won out and kind of go from there. So excuse me. By the way, these two competing visions really laid the groundwork for the nation's first political parties. Initially, political parties aren't mentioned in the Constitution. George Washington, as you might have remember from the Maclay text, was very much against political parties. He associated them with factions. And he thought basically parties, had their own interests in mind, that of the interests of themselves, their narrow affiliation, their narrow group, and not the broader common interest. And that cuts against the fundamentals of republicanism, Republican government, and democracy. That was fundamentally George Washington's belief, and he sort of warned about things going in this direction of factions and like formal political parties that were opposed to each other and at each other's throats on many or every issue. He warned about that in his farewell address. But sure enough, that's how things worked out, right? So the first political parties are basically made in the images of, on the one hand, Alexander Hamilton, and on the other hand, Thomas Jefferson. So the Hamiltonians become essentially the Federalist Party. And the Jeffersonians, followers essentially of the philosophy of Thomas Jefferson, which I'll talk about in a few minutes here, become the Democratic Republicans. Technically no relationship to the eventual Republican Party, which is still around today, the party of Ronald Reagan and eventually Donald Trump, and all the way back in the mid-19th century, Abraham Lincoln. This is a different Republican Party. Really, they're Jeffersonian Republicans. Technically, they're called Democratic Republicans. All right. So so Hamilton is the first Secretary of the Treasury appointed by Washington. He's a great admirer, interestingly, ironically, of the British form of government. That being said, he was an American patriot. He was instrumental, one of the instrumental elite patriots in spearheading the American Revolution. But his idea is that we should be independent from England, but we should model our structure, our political and even economic structure and other things around England. He really believed in a strong chief executive, almost akin to, well, you could say a monarch, a king, right? So yeah, great admirer of the British form of government, which made him, his ideas controversial to say the least, in the independent United States, right? He's most famous for his Hamiltonian economic program. Let's lay out some details here. So, some different aspects of this. He believed in he wanted a national debt. He thought a national debt would create a bond between the money classes and the government. Number one, he thought that debt is, as a result of that, debt can be good, right? So too much debt is a bad thing, but debt, if it's kept within certain boundaries, a national debt can be a good thing that keeps your moneyed elites working in the interests hand in hand with the state and not against the state. Britain was a country that was heavily in debt. Remember, he was sort of an Anglophile. He admired the British, so maybe it's not surprising that that he advocated a national debt. Kind of related to this is the federal assumption, quote, assumption of state debts, right? So he urges Congress. This is the early 1790s, basically, the first administration. He urges Congress to assume the debts of the states incurred during the Revolution. And this is designed to chain the states more tightly to the federal government. And wealthy creditors under this idea will now be loyal to the federal government, kind of as I mentioned a second ago, rather than their individual interests or their individual states, the state of New York or the state of Massachusetts or Maryland or whatever. Not surprisingly, there was disagreement on this. Heavily indebted states like Massachusetts generally enthusiastically supported this idea of federal assumption of state, individual state debts. Less indebted states, for example, like Virginia, generally opposed, not surprisingly, this aspect of the Hamiltonian economic program, right? Also, he wanted a Bank of the United States. So essentially, he wanted a 20-year monopoly banking charter from the federal government, right? For this, quote, Bank of the United States. And the idea was this bank will lend the government money and accept its deposits and kind of get the country's financial ball rolling, get the country on its firm financial footing. And remember all the trouble during the Revolutionary War and especially in the crisis within the context of the critical period, the mid 1780s, the quote crisis, the economic crises of the 1780s and other crises. So stability was something that Hamilton wanted, and one of the ways to gain stability was this Bank of the United States in his estimation. He wanted as well new taxes to fund the debt. So he envisioned like tariffs on imported goods, excise taxes on luxury goods like whiskey, for example. He also believed that manufacturing was the future. And this very much puts him at odds with someone like Thomas Jefferson, who I'll get into in a second, right? He goes so far as to propose federal subsidies for manufacturing and a protective tariff. So essentially taxing foreign manufacturers that make their way into the United States, giving domestic manufacturing a leg up. So remember, this is the 1790s. So let's kind of zoom out a little bit to think about manufacturing and the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution really begins in England around 1750, and it's making its way kind of drip by drip, slowly but surely to America. But during this time, America is a very spread out, especially in the 1790s, even the first decade of the 1800s, and many decades after that to a large extent as well. America is a very agriculturally based rural nation. It's not very urbanized for the most part. So you have growing seaport cities, but those are, I mean, by today's standards, essentially small towns, right? Tiny little seaport towns like Philadelphia, New York City, Boston, right? So he thought manufacturing was the future. He thought manufacturing would take place in, like it had in Britain, in some of these big urban centers, right, and be the economic kind of foundation for some of these big urban centers, and people were going to flood into the cities, and he thought that was a good thing. But around 1790, there's not a whole lot of manufacturing. Manufacturing doesn't really even begin to really take off in the United States until the decade of the 1810s, second decade of the 19th century, with like the Waltham Wool system, the first modern factory, textile manufacturing. We'll talk more about that actually in next week's video. But anyway, he kind of sees the future here to a certain extent in manufacturing, but that's controversial. Not everybody is on board with that. And chief among those who are opposed to these ideas is Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson, he was the leader of the opposition to Hamilton. He thought the future of the United States lies in agriculture, right? Being a spread out nation of what he called yeoman farmers, right? Sort of middle class farmers producing their own food, engaging in some trade. So kind of capitalistic form of farming to a certain extent, but also engaging in some subsistence agriculture. Jefferson, that is very much opposed to urbanization and large scale manufacturing. He's not totally, I was going to mention this as well, he's not totally against manufacturing. He just prefers household manufacturers, right? So he wants, it's okay to make things yourself. Things that you need around the house. It's even okay to sell those in the market, but this like large scale industrialization, like what was taking place in, for example, the textile mills in Manchester, England, he thought this is a very old Republican idea, meaning republicanism, right? Idea that made its way to the colonies and was highly influential in the early days of the Republic, first days of the Republic, which is that urbanization and industrialization, and those two things kind of go hand in hand, tend to, tend to lead to, it creates poverty, and poverty in turn creates vice. So a lot of vices tend to, it's a sort of a bad context morally, right? These urban centers, like bad things are happening. People aren't living virtuously. People aren't living sort of as in a sense, God intended, right? There was something kind of unnatural about it. It led to, again, impoverishment and slums and a huge amount of inequality. And there was some evidence in England, like in Manchester, England, to support that, right? So that's definitely part and parcel with Jefferson's idea of a nation of yeoman farmers, right? Not a nation of spearheaded by urbanized industrialization, right? Let's see, he was very skeptical of this idea of a national debt. He sees it as essentially swindling future generations, right? He was suspicious of central government as well. He supported, in general, localism. He was a strong supporter of, states' rights, local rule, and just leaving what's absolutely necessary for the functioning of the country to the federal government, to the national government. He was skeptical of moneyed financial interests as well. He kind of saw Hamilton and his ilk as schemers, as speculators, right? So he kind of saw them as engaging in these fancy money tricks, right? That were part and parcel with what we would call nowadays kind of the rise of American capitalism, the rise certainly of financial capitalism, complex financial instruments, right? Big corporations. He was highly skeptical of that. Okay, so again, actually, let me back up a little bit. So Jefferson becomes president in 1800, very contested presidential election, but Jefferson becomes president in 1800. And this kind of ushers in a period of what historians call Jeffersonian democracy. You can see that up here, right? And it's, by the way, it's not just Jefferson winning the presidency, but Jeffersonian Republicans, right, capital R, what's known as the Democratic Republican Party, they win big. Just in general in Congress. So they kind of take over politics to a certain extent. And they have a new way of seeing politics, which I'll get into in a second. And a lot of that is, through Jefferson occupying the presidency. He was president from 1800 to the end of 1808, basically. But there's other aspects of it too. It's a change, definitely a change. So let's get into some aspects of this Jeffersonian vision embodied by Jefferson's decisive victory and the Jeffersonians' decisive victory in the election of 1800, right? So agricultural republic, right? So Jefferson and his ilk believed in a nation of self-reliant, independent, middle class, i.e. Yeoman farmers, right? They favored small businesses over big businesses. They favored, as I mentioned a second ago, household manufacturing. They weren't against entrepreneurship, right? But they were sort of for rugged entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship within the context of a small business, as opposed to within the context of a big bloated corporation, for example. Heavy emphasis on local communities and local government, again, localism, right? Actually, so you could say that's the Louisiana Purchase. I'll get to that in a second. Let me also talk really quickly about Jefferson's style. Jefferson's style. So he was very casual and dressed informally in a lot of cases. And not just in dress, but also in behavior. He refused to deliver speeches to Congress, for example. And he claimed that under the guise that the reasoning that under the reasoning that to do so, to deliver a speech to Congress, and they would all sort of be obligated to stand up and clap and applaud him, it reminded him too much of a king, right? So that kind of gives you an insight into his ideology, his view of the presidency, for example, and his how a president should comport himself. So let's see. Also, during this era, there was an expansion in voting rights. Property qualifications for voting are lessened to a certain extent, right? That's in keeping with this Jeffersonian philosophy of a nation of yeoman farmers. Now, certainly there's limits to that. Native Americans, Black Americans, both free and enslaved, obviously are not included in that, right? And continue to not be included in that through the Jacksonian era, which we'll get to. But it is an expansion in many ways of democracy, right? Extremely, the Jeffersonians envisioned and put forth an extremely minimal role for the federal government. Most Americans never interacted at all with the federal government. Prior to the Jeffersonians taking power, and they wanted to mostly keep it that way, right? Or you could say maybe to the minor extent that Americans did, some Americans interacted with the federal government. They wanted to sort of get rid of that, right? So your interactions with government should be at the local level. The federal government, maybe you could say the best federal government is seen and not heard, right? Was sort of their philosophy, Jefferson's philosophy. Another interesting thing here is a shift from a view of politicians and the role of politicians, political figures, going from fathers of the people to friends of the people, right? This is bizarre. This is kind of hard to wrap your mind around in a contemporary context, but there was, even in the first days of an independent United States, universally, it was assumed that the political class were occupied by elites, right? These elites were moneyed, many of them fairly affluent, wealthy, landed. They were sort of in a sense, American aristocracy, right? And it was assumed that they would occupy political positions, and they kind of saw themselves as fathers of the people. They saw their role as kind of overseers, right, of the public space. And in a sense, they knew better how to structure government than the common people did. There wasn't a whole lot of vigorous campaigning. As well, that was seen as being beneath such semi-aristocratic gentlemen, gentlemanly wealthy class of sort of natural elites. So again, they saw themselves as kind of fathers of the people. It's a very paternalistic attitude, and this was largely accepted. This is the part that's hard for us to wrap our minds around. This was largely accepted in most cases by common people, right? That was kind of the way government worked, right? Even in this, new experiment, right? This newly independent United States, this democratic republic, right? So the Jeffersonians, I think, saw, for the most part, saw things differently. So they didn't envision themselves as fathers of the people. They saw themselves really as more like friends of the people, right? So they're almost like, it's like your wealthy friend, your wealthy, well-educated, elite friend who's working for you, right? They're working on behalf of the people. They're the people's representatives, right? In more of a modern a way that comports better with our modern notions of what the role of a politician, if that makes sense. Okay, let's get to the Louisiana Purchase. You can't talk about Jeffersonian democracy and Jefferson's presidency without talking about the Louisiana Purchase, right? So this doubled the size of the United States. So yeah, as you can see in the map here. So the part in green is the Louisiana Purchase superimposed over a modern map of the United States and the 50 states. So France once again owns Louisiana. This is via a treaty with Spain prior to the Louisiana Purchase, right? A few years prior to that. So yeah, this territory is owned by France. Napoleon dreams initially of a large American empire, but rebellion, basically things happen that makes him rethink this, right? So there's a rebellion in Haiti, so the Haitian Revolution in 1804 that overthrew the French government there. He gets bogged down in the Napoleonic Wars from about 1800 to 1815 in Europe, right? He needs money and he decides to kind of have a fire sale here, right? To sell New France, to sell this huge swath of territory in the middle of North America to the Americans if they want it, for a pretty cheap price, right? Some interesting details about this. So the U.S. ambassador to France, ambassadors to France which included James Monroe, who eventually became president, tried to buy New Orleans from Napoleon, and Jefferson actually says, okay, you can buy New Orleans, just New Orleans essentially, and I'll let you spend between $2 and $6 billion. And Napoleon hears that offer and says, you know what, I have a better offer for you. How about I sell you North America for $15 million? Of course, it's not North America in its entirety, but this would and indeed did double the size of the United States for a mere $15 million. Obviously, that's that would be, I think I heard this at one point, how many dollars this would come out to in modern day dollars. I forget the exact figure. It's in the billions for sure, but it's $15 million even in the early 19th century is a very low amount of money when you're dealing with states buying land, huge swaths of land from other states. So this was a very good deal, right? So from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, right? Farmers in the West get access to the Mississippi River, the port of New Orleans, right, to ship their crops, like let's say cotton and wheat, all over the world, right? It makes them more marketable. It makes makes farming more capitalistic and profitable. The reaction to this was interesting. So Jefferson is very pleased, right? He thought, this fit very well with his vision of a nation of yeoman farmers, right? So if we have a nation where essentially everyone or almost everyone is a farmer, it's spread out, it's rural, where eventually you're going to run out of land, you need to find new land, and they did, right? Although, of course, Native Americans still lived here, and I'll get to that in the second, I think the second video for this week. So we'll hold that thought. So yeah, Jefferson is very pleased. He thought this laid the groundwork for westward expansion and a nation of yeoman farmers rather than a nation crowded into cluttered and vice-stricken cities, right? In industrializing context, though he worried that it might be, Jefferson did worry that it might be too much, and he also worried about the constitutionality of this, and also its role in doubling the national debt as well. So this, this was on very shaky constitutional ground. I think Maclay gets into this. The Hamiltonians were the strict constructionists, and the Jeffersonians. The Jeffersonians were the strict constructionists, right? Letter of the law when it comes to the Constitution. The Hamiltonians were the loose constructionists, right? And this is a very loose constructionist maneuver, this doubling of the United States, just by the executive branch, by Jefferson and his ilk, right? So this made it controversial in some cases. Oops. So that, yeah, for example, the Federalist opposition party gets nervous And they think this is going to cause them to disappear as a party. They're the party of, to the extent that the United States is an urban a nation of sort of cities and even towns, right? That's the Federalist constituency, especially in the North, right? Where most of the nascent, towns, cities, if you can call them that, were in places like Massachusetts, like Boston. So they, this nation of yeoman farmers, that was just going to give more votes to the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, right? So they opposed it kind of on those grounds. They thought it was kind of constitutionally hypocritical of Jefferson as well, and they hit him on that. They thought this would kind of lay the groundwork for the disappearance of their party potentially, and indeed it did. It wasn't the only factor, but the Federalists are on their way out during, in the early 19th century, to be replaced by the Whigs and eventually the the Republican Party, not the Democratic Republicans, but the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. Okay, so significant other important consequences of the Louisiana Purchase. And by the way, this is a map of the United States in 1803, including the Louisiana Purchase. You see the Oregon Territory in sort of the northwest portion of the continent. Mexico is still owned by the Southwest, essentially is still owned by Spain. You have the Mississippi Territory as well. Florida controlled by Spain at this time as well. So other consequences, this gives America an inherently enormous supply of natural resources. Think about all the natural resources you can tap, even just outside of access to land for farming, right, for homesteads. Think of all the natural resources you could tap via the Louisiana Purchase. It does indeed lead to significant westward expansion. And yeah, really abundant land is, and this is a big thing with the Jeffersonians, and Jefferson himself is sort of the great equalizer, right? So people, with a lack of land, and people crowded into cities, you see burgeoning inequality. But if people are able to spread out and start build new homesteads in the frontier, and eventually towns and new cities, new regional economies, and everything is sort of connected, then that's kind of widespread middle-class prosperity. That was the vision. Okay. Excuse me. Let's get to the War of 1812, or specifically, before I get there specifically, I want to talk about the Embargo Act of 1807. So Jefferson, this is definitely a blemish for the most part in Jefferson's record. So kind of the context here is that, Jefferson closes all the U.S. ports in 1807. This is in response to Britain and France refusing to respect American neutrality in the high seas, right? So American shipping merchants were doing pretty good business, especially considering the Napoleonic Wars were going on, basically as operating as neutral ships, right? So the idea was, we're not aligned with the French or the British. We don't have really a dog in this fight. We're just trying to make money and bring supplies and goods and trade back and forth. And this was working pretty well until there was interference, right? This was getting in the way of this commercial republic. This was causing a lot of merchants to go out of business, right? And remember, this commercial republic was in many ways the linchpin of a prosperous United States for people like Jefferson, even to a certain extent for someone like Hamilton, definitely for someone like Madison as well. So Jefferson, in response, closes all the U.S. He decides to play hardball, essentially, and he closes all the U.S. ports. He tries to force Britain and France to respect American neutral shipping, right? And as a result, and by the way, this lasts for about 15 months. It's partially rescinded after that. It's sort of complicated. I'm not going to get into all the details here. But basically, this is a at least 15-month experiment in essentially what we call autarky, right? So this is almost complete and total isolation from trade with the rest of the world. And things did not, as you can expect, America, even in the early 19th century, was very connected to the rest of the world, and this did not go very well, right? I think one historian one famous historian tried to estimate the economic hit the United States economy took, and I think he estimated it was around 10%. So we lost around 10% of GDP because of this, of gross domestic product, because of this 15-month sort of bizarre experiment in autarky. So this is an embarrassment for Jefferson. This ruins a lot of international shipping merchants, and just not good for the American economy overall. Also, during this time, you have war hawks in Congress, right? A lot of these are Southern politicians, actually. And this is the first generation of American political leaders who ever lived under British rule. Who never lived under British rule, right? So this makes them, I would say, a little more hungry for a fight. So they, many of them actually, at least initially, supported the embargo, because it was seen as sort of economic tit for tat, what was happening in the United States was economic warfare, so we need to give them economic warfare back, right? And they began calling for real warfare, right? To do something about interference in American neutral shipping. And also, and this is mainly directed at the British, but also the French to a certain extent. But with regards to the British, so many of these war hawks were concerned, were angry that the British were arming Indians to fight Americans on the frontier, right? So allying themselves with Native Americans against the American interests. They were, again, upset about impressment of American soldiers and interference in American shipping as well. And so this leads to the War of 1812, in a sense, the Second American Revolution, right? So as a part of the War of 1812, we see a failed invasion by the Americans of Canada, right? Most of the fighting takes place in the Great Lakes region. There we go. Yeah, that's the causes. Yeah, by the way, New England and commercial cities strongly opposed this war. One of the big reasons was economic, right? So these commercial cities, they had to put up with this embargo. And I mean, first of all, they had to put up with American independence, which changed things economically for them dramatically. They had to change their business practices in the parts of the world they were doing business with, these international traders, international shipping merchants. And then this embargo hits and it puts a lot of them out of business, makes things really difficult. And then they get out on the other side of that and they want to go to war with Britain, and that's going to hamper their commercial activities as well. So they strongly opposed, in New England, these commercial cities, the commercial class strongly opposed this war, right? And also it's Madison's war. He's of the opposite party. Most in the New England sort of commercial merchant class are Federalists. So there's an inherent suspicion there. Okay, so yeah, failed invasion of Canada. Most of the fighting takes place in the Great Lakes region. The White House is burned down, as crazy as it is to realize that, to think about that, but that actually happened. And, not a whole lot actually comes out of this war directly, in terms of really it ends in sort of a stalemate, right? So it ends in the Treaty of Ghent. With the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, everything is essentially returned to the way it was before. In a sense, nobody won, right? Both sides essentially agreed to stop fighting. So this is more of an armistice. There we go. Not easy to say for some reason. Yeah, so both sides agreed to essentially stop fighting, return things to where they were before. But there were important consequences at the same time. This leads to a surge in American nationalism. This is in large part the birth of American manufacturing, although I would say the Embargo Act of 1807 is in large part responsible for that as well, right? So when you can't, when you're cut off from the rest of the world, that encourages you to make your own stuff, right? So that's when we see some of the earliest experiments in like textile manufacturing. And then during the War of 1812, there's trade disruptions, right? But also you just need munitions, right? You need weapons, bullets, and just food and clothes and shoes, et cetera, to fight a war. And it's much more convenient to produce it yourself, right? So this stimulates the earliest American manufacturing. And this also is the death knell for the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party, at least a faction of the Federalist Party, secretly meet to consider seceding from the United States and rejoining Britain. And when The war isn't lost, at least. That sort of discredits them, and one thing leads to another, and the Federalist Party is pretty much kaputs after the War of 1812 ends in about 1815. Okay, so let's see. Let's go and stop there, and let's pick it up with video 2, where I'm going to transition to a discussion of Indian policy within the context of mostly the Jacksonian era and Andrew Jackson, although I'm going to go back before that a little bit to set up the context. Okay, so I'll see you for video 2.